Welcome back. Rising tensions between the United States and China. Health and Human Services Secretary Alex Azar leading a high-level visit to Taiwan. It is the first visit by a U.S. cabinet official in 6 years. The U.S. and China agreed to meet later this month to review the implementation of that Phase 1 trade deal. Joining me right now to talk more about that is the Daily Wire writer, Ian Haworth. And Ian, it's great to have you this morning. Thanks very much for joining us. Well, things are certainly getting tough between the U.S. and China at this point. But I guess China did buy that $200 billion in commodities, soybeans, that it had promised the United States. Where are we in your view?
Well, I think the important thing to think about whenever we talk about China is to look at them in the context of their recent history. I think it's very easy to get distracted with certain instances of the news. For example, TikTok is in the news. People are talking about whether or not we should force them to sell it or to close it down due to spying concerns. What we've got to think about is the fact that the Chinese Communist Party is an evil regime. It's a dictatorship that doesn't care about human rights. And we need to be approaching our relationship with them with that in mind. And in my view, retreating from that arrangement we have with them, time after time, we've learned this lesson that they are simply not to be trusted on the world stage. I think coronavirus has shown us that. And so whenever I talk about China, yes, they might follow through with one deal here or there. It's within their interest to follow through. But I think we've got to make sure that we do not forget that, quite frankly, they're an evil dictatorship. And buying some amount of soybeans doesn't change that.
That is exactly right, Ian. I could not agree further, because the truth is we've seen evidence over and over again of this steady intellectual property theft, which the CCP just refuses to even admit. So how do you see a relationship or a partnership, a business partnership, taking place over the long term if it's pretty clear at this point that 40 years of engagement has not worked?
I simply don't really see it happening. I think the Chinese government have shown their hand over and over and over again, and really it's a matter of globalist naivety that we keep falling for it. I mean, again, to go back to the coronavirus is the Chinese government's fault. I think especially in the United States, there's a lot of arguments over who to blame, whether it's state governments, federal governments. The Democrats are doing mental backflips to try and blame Trump for every single thing that's happened to do with coronavirus. But ultimately, it's because the Chinese government kept it under wraps for so long. They forced journalists into silence. Some people were even disappeared. This is a brutal regime. And so when we consider that every element of Chinese life, including media, including businesses, are only allowed to exist with the express permission of the Communist Party, I don't really see how we can, in good conscience, work with them. I mean, especially if you look at the human rights abuses right now. I mean, China is the world's largest producer of cotton, and in the region where 84% of China's cotton is produced are these Uyghur concentration camps. And so if we, especially with a lot of the woke protests going on to do with Black Lives Matter and systematic racism, the Chinese government exemplifies that, and yet a lot of people don't really care, because ultimately it comes down to people like cheap sneakers, they like cheap clothes, they like cheap electronics. We as a country and consumers need to make that decision, because money will out. I think the NBA has shown that too. So to answer your question, I don't really see a relationship growing or flourishing if we are able to look ourselves in the mirror at the end of the day.
Well, what's going on with the Democrats? It seems that every time Kevin McCarthy asks to bring a bill to the floor, Nancy Pelosi will not do it, bring a bill to the floor to keep China accountable. And I continue to hear, in fact, I heard it again yesterday, speaking with a very high-up insider who told me that the CCP is in constant motion trying to influence policy at every turn. Local elections, mayors, and congressmen and congresswomen sitting Congress today. So how worried should we be that the CCP is trying to influence our sitting congressmen and women right now as they try to influence policy?
Well, I think we should be very worried, and we should assume that they're doing so. I mean, I'm not really surprised. China is involved in so many areas of world life. I mean, if you think about their actions in the internet, their actions through various companies spying. I mean, we just had a consulate in Houston that was shut down for spying. So the notion that they're lobbying and pushing people in government for the policies they wish isn't really a surprise. The issue with the Democrats is due to, in a lot of cases, Trump derangement syndrome, they're more focused on 2020 than anything else. So the fact that we have who should be our #1 global enemy, China, where we should have a bipartisan agreement that we need to change our relationship with them, the Democrats are far more focused on maintaining power in 2020, on hiding the fact that Joe Biden is a terrible candidate who can barely put a sentence together, by blaming Trump for literally everything that is wrong in the world, whether it's his fault or not. Again, bringing it back to the coronavirus, I think it's a perfect example of there are legitimate criticisms of Trump when it comes to the coronavirus, but ultimately it's China's fault. But if you were asked to ask a Democrat that, you would never even think that China had put a step wrong. It's quite horrendous to view, really.
That's right. And you recently wrote a piece comparing this to 1930s Nazi Germany. We'll talk more about that. Ian, please come back soon. Thanks very much. Ian Haworth joining us today.